It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces as well as a few new ones. And I want to extend a particularly warm welcome, especially to those of you who are joining the seminar for the first time. Once again, we've packed the house, so we do have some chairs up here. So please feel free to move up here and get a front row seat. Before we begin our conversation this morning, I briefly want to introduce to our out-of-town guests especially, the Cushwa Center's new postdoctoral fellow, Maggie Elmore, who joined us this summer from the University of California, Berkeley, where she recently earned a PhD in history. And if you read the acknowledgments to this book carefully, you'll see that she also served as David's research assistant on this wonderful book. Also, now in his second year with us is Pete Chaika, who's back there. Many of you know Pete already, but we're very grateful to have these two postdoctoral fellows with us at the Cushwa Center. For those of you who are seminar regulars especially, please introduce yourself to Maggie or Pete during the break if you haven't yet met them. I'd also like to thank Shane Ulbrich, Cushwa's assistant director, for his help in organizing the seminar and all of our events, and also Madonna Noak, who's also standing back there. Madonna is relatively new to the Cushwa Center, but she has been instrumental in continuing Cushwa's tradition of hospitality established by our founding director, Jay Dolan, and continued by my predecessors, Scott Appleby and Tim Matavina. Speaking of proud traditions at the Cushwa Center, this is our marquee event, as those of you who are regulars know. Since 1980, the Seminar in American Religion has provided historians and scholars of North American religion with an opportunity to discuss a recent notable book published in the field. And I believe we have at least two people here who were at the very first Seminar in American Religion, which featured Marty's work, Phil Gleason and Tom Kesselman. Is there anyone else? Father Bill, were you at that first seminar? Okay. We'll have to check in the archives and see. So it's great to reconvene. The topic of today's seminar, of course, is David Hollinger's most recent book, Protestants Abroad, How Missionaries Tried to Change the World but Changed America, published last year by Princeton University Press. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this morning, beginning with our distinguished author. David Hollinger is the Preston Hotchkis Professor of History Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He received his PhD at Berkeley and began teaching at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and spent around 15 years as a full professor at the University of Michigan before returning to Berkeley as a faculty member in 1992, where he remained until his retirement. It'd be impossible to list all of his publications, so I'll just list some of the major ones in intellectual and religious history. In the American Province, Studies in the History and Historiography of Ideas, published in 1989. Science, Jews, and Secular Culture, which appeared in 1996. Post-Ethnic America, Beyond Multiculturalism in 1999, third edition published in 2006. A 3-volume series in the American Intellectual Tradition, co-edited with Charles Capper and published in 2006. And After Cloven Tongues of Fire, Protestant Liberalism in Modern American History, published in 2013. David, of course, has supervised many dissertations over the course of his career, and his work has had a profound impact on American religious and intellectual history. David is a member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, a member of the Institute for Advanced Study, and the Harmsworth Visiting Professor of American History at the University of Oxford. He served as president of the Organization of American Historians in 2010 and 2011. I remember well David's last visit to Notre Dame in April of 1997. That was for a history department conference to honor Philip Gleason, Professor Emeritus of History at Notre Dame, who is back with us today. It's always a delight to have Phil back with us. And I also, this prompts me, I was a doctoral student then. As I told David last night, I was a little too intimidated to actually talk to him at that conference, even though I was at his talk. So I know there are many doctoral students in history in the room today, and I know that many of you have read his book in various classes, and I want to encourage you to not be like me, and please do introduce yourself to David. He's not as intimidating as he sounds from his writing. And please, it's one of the great things about studying history here at Notre Dame is the opportunity to meet with such renowned scholars, even before you've taken your comprehensive examinations. So please, we encourage you to fully engage with the seminar. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to campus, David. Thank you for being with us. We are fortunate to have two excellent commentators to get our discussion started this morning, Rebecca Tinio McKenna and Marie Griffith. Rebecca McKenna is Assistant Professor of History here at Notre Dame, specializing in U.S. history as well as cultural, economic, imperial, social, and South Asian and Indian history. She received her bachelor's from Barnard College and her PhD from Yale. Rebecca's research centers on modern American social and cultural history, particularly the history of U.S. imperialism, political economy, and the intersections of capitalism and culture. She teaches undergraduate courses on the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, interwar America, and U.S. social and cultural history, as well as graduate courses on 20th century U.S. history and comparative empires, and I believe was one of the classes in which the doctoral students in this room read David's book. Rebecca's first book, American Imperial Pastoral, The Architecture of U.S. Colonialism in the Philippines, was published in 2017 by the University of Chicago Press and recently received a prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. That book examines imperial ideologies and contests for colonial power through a study of the built environment. Rebecca's current book project is A History of the Piano, from the ivory trade in Zanzibar to a Connecticut company town called Ivoryton, and finally to the American middle-class parlor. Rebecca, thank you for being with us today. Our second commentator, Marie Griffith, is the John C. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she directs the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Marie's research includes religion, gender, and American politics. She received her PhD in religion from Harvard University and held postdoctoral fellowships at Princeton and Northwestern University before joining the faculty at Princeton as Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion. She was promoted to full professor there in 2005, where she directed the Women and Gender Studies program and received multiple awards for distinguished teaching. Marie spent 2 years at Harvard University as the John A. Bartlett Professor before moving to Washington University in 2011. I'll also keep Marie's list of publications very brief, just naming her first major publication, God's Daughters, Evangelical Women and the Power of Submission, which examined the practices and perceptions of contemporary evangelical women. That was published in 1997. And of course, I'll just mention briefly her most recent book, Moral Combat: How Sex Divided American Christians and Fractured American Politics, which was published in December of 2017 and inspired the subject of this year's Cushwa Center lecture, which Marie delivered right here at Notre Dame this past Thursday. And I know many of you in the audience were at that as well. And it was a wonderful lecture, so we're delighted to get the most out of Marie this week. And we thank you for joining us for multiple events, Marie. For those of you who are new to the seminar, just a quick note on our format. We'll hear from our commentators first, and then we'll give David an opportunity to respond to them briefly. We'll take a quick coffee break and reconvene and open the floor for a general discussion. With that, please join me in welcoming our first commentator, Rebecca McKenna.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Kathy, for the introduction and for inviting me to participate in this seminar. I'm absolutely delighted and very much honored to have a chance to comment on David's work and to be at the table, too, with Marie, and to be here with all of you. So, again, thank you. I found it quite difficult to determine where to begin in crafting comments on an elegant book that generously contributes to a host of literatures. But since the research I do, as Kathy mentioned, is primarily in U.S. social and cultural history, as well as the history of the U.S. and the world, my comments will address what I see to be the contributions of Protestants abroad to those fields in particular. And I'll start by sharing that as I read David's book, I kept thinking of a short story that I often teach in courses on the Gilded Age, Progressive Era, and course on the U.S. and the world. It's the short story is John Luther Long's Madame Butterfly from 1898. And you probably know the story. An American naval officer, Pinkerton, who's stationed in Nagasaki in the late 19th century, takes up with a Japanese woman named Cho-Cho-san. Pinkerton decides, rather derides her culture, alienates her from her family, and yet the two produce a child tellingly named Trouble. Pinkerton soon leaves for other shores, and Cho-Cho-san is left expectantly awaiting him. In the end, Pinkerton does return, but with a white American wife who manages to meet Trouble and take an interest in adopting the child. Cho-Cho-san is distraught, and at the very end attempts suicide. The story, which, as you probably know, inspired Puccini's opera and remains very much a mainstay of opera companies' repertoires around the world, comes to mind because it's been understood that John Luther Long drew in part from the experiences of his sister, Jenny Correll, who with her husband served with the American Methodist Mission in Nagasaki in the late 19th century. And the short story was published just as the United States was embarking on extracontinental colonialism in the Caribbean and in the Philippines. And the tale, again, inspired at least in part by Correll's missionary experiences, took a critical eye to a certain kind of US presence in Asia. So in some regards, the story David tells of missionaries coming to question American interventions in the world, well, this is not wholly new. But what is revelatory in his account, it seems to me, is that come the early and mid-20th centuries, these missionaries and missionary-connected men and women came to take a hard look at themselves, their presence in Asia, and also what he calls their home culture. And it's a process of self-reflection that, I believe he persuasively shows, proved consequential for life over here and over there. These missionary men and women and their children, primarily of mainline Protestant denominations, spent formative years in Asia, in many cases learning the language of their adopted home. Hollinger argues that their experience with alterity, sustained experience with people abroad and unlike themselves, out in the mission field, and eventually in conferences where Asian converts confronted missionaries with the limits of denominationalism and made their case for indigenization, these experiences provoked self-interrogation. And an outcome of this self-reflection was a perception of the provincialism of the original missionary project, and even further, a new politics, if you will, stances opposed to cultural imperialism and US paternalism, and visions of realizing a wider, even universal human community. This new outlook, a missionary cosmopolitanism, Hollinger argues, helped to sharpen the growing wedge between Protestant liberals and fundamentalists, and it contributed to a shift toward what he calls post-Protestant secularism. It also came to be expressed in a variety of ways that to me are at the heart of the book, in the ecumenical movement within Protestantism, in the promotion of or engagement with, quote, domestic programs that would later be called multicultural, and in the generation of, quote, foreign policies that prioritized alliances with non-white colonized peoples. This, to me, seems the general drift in seeing, feeling, and thinking that David argues for, even while noting that his actors did not take their cosmopolitanism in exactly the same direction. I think this is the point that is made particularly well in that second chapter on Henry Lou's Pearl Buck and John Hershey, and it's certainly made again and again in his sensitive renderings of individual lives and careers in later chapters. David emphasizes that timing matters to this story. The first generation of these missionaries whom he discusses went into the field when Protestant theology was being reshaped by the social gospel movement. And in that regard, it's not just timing that he emphasizes, but clearly religious ideology itself. His study, then, unlike some others dealing with religion in US foreign affairs, is not simply about religious discourses. Timing matters to his story in another way, because it was at mid-century, as the US entered the Cold War, that affairs in Asia appeared central to US security. And as the process of decolonization gripped what we now call the global South, Americans became focused on advancing their geopolitical and geoeconomic interests in the region. This context created an opening for these white Protestant missionaries, and even more so, their sons and daughters. These men and women were chief among those few Americans who had familiarity with the region and even its languages, and of course who came from a social group with significant cultural and political power. So this is obviously just a skeletal sketch of the book, but I think it's sufficient to now suggest some of its major contributions, particularly from the vantage of US cultural history and the history of the US in the world. So for one, I think Hollinger's, David's book demonstrates the rich payoff of what has become a dominant paradigm for scholars of the US and the world, and arguably for US history at large. And that's a view that the foreign, or what we call the foreign and the domestic, have shaped each other over time. Attention to their mutual constitution is a project at least 25 years old, if we date an explicit and earnest commitment to it to the 1993 collection of essays, Cultures of United States Imperialism, edited by Donald Pease and Amy Kaplan. This collection had issued a sort of scholarly call to arms, noting, quote, the absence of the United States from the post-colonial study of imperialism and the absence of empire from the study of American culture. This collection encouraged recognition that much that we may construe as narrowly domestic has, in fact, been shaped through transnational, international, and global relations. Work like Pease and Kaplan's, part of the transnational turn in U.S. historiography, helped to inspire a new kind of diplomatic history, one that has looked outside official state archives and beyond state actors, so-called, and taken culture, social relations, especially gender and race, and the experiences of people on the receiving end of U.S. power as central to the understanding of the history of the United States in the world. Arguably, that attention to culture, along with a series of geopolitical events begging for historical explanation in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, these were key contexts for the significant attention accorded religion in the study of U.S. foreign affairs in the past dozen or so years. From my vantage, Protestants Abroad, intentionally or not, is an expression of the kind of illuminating and even provocative history-telling made possible by these scholarly turns. His account offers us, I think, some new approaches to old problems. So first, and perhaps most simply, where much existing literature has attended to the role of American Protestants in the world largely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I'm thinking here of even more recent work like Ian Tyrrell's terrific Reforming the World, the Creation of America's Moral Empire, which is not exclusively on missionaries. But that also concerns really the late 19th and early 20th century, where David pushes forward, bridging through the study of his particular group of actors, and effectively, I think, 2 generations within it, periods in the history of the U.S. and the world that are often treated apart from each other. William Hutchison's Errand to the World from 1989 does this too, but unlike Tyrrell and David's books, his does not particularly focus on the boomerang dynamic, the way that the missionaries' experience comes back to exert unexpected influence on developments within the United States. Second, I think David's account gives elements of a new history of 20th century development, a subject that has been taken up by at least one of his own grad students, I believe. This history would cast Protestant missionaries and their affiliates in leading roles. Historians of modernization like Niels Gilman and David Ekblad have noted the role of missionaries, but David gives us considerably more than they do, and significant reason to continue probing the missionary origins of mid-20th century modernization in particular, and 20th century development at large, problem, in fact, that has been taken up by one of our recent PhDs in history and peace studies here at Notre Dame. As the case of missionaries' role in the development of development suggests, missionaries and missionary-affiliated men and women may have failed at the task of attracting impressive numbers of religious converts overseas, but their influence on U.S. foreign policy in Asia seems clear. Some of these non-state actors came to assume significant state roles, whether as intelligence officers during World War II, devising interrogation and anti-torture policies, or in advising the State Department on South Asia affairs in the case of Kenneth Landon. As one reviewer has neatly put this point, while liberal Protestants lost the church, they gained the world. This is hardly a story of decline, or not solely one. Third, and most importantly, I suspect that Hollinger's account is one that many readers, at least ones outside this room, may not expect in a history of white Protestant missionaries. That they came to develop and act on a set of commitments to anti-imperialism and anti-racism, that we must look to this cadre of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and their experiences overseas, at least in part, for a politics that posed some challenge to their own group's position of privilege at home. In this regard, Hollinger's study, like Michael Thompson's For God and Globe, which concerns the making of Christian internationalism and focuses more tightly on the 20s and the 30s, demonstrates that Protestants have not always been a party to Christian nationalism, a worldview we might associate when dwelling on mid-20th century politics with a figure like John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State and the grandson of a Presbyterian missionary in India. Hollinger notes Dulles's participation in the 1937 Oxford Conference. He emerges later in the book transformed, perhaps, or at least having pulled his experience in a different direction than some of the missionary-connected men and women he employed and dismissed. In any case, I see Protestants Abroad as a reminder that Dulles's was not the only brand of Protestant internationalism during the Cold War. If Protestants Abroad shows the limits of Christian nationalism, I think it also prompts further assessment of the concept of cultural imperialism and suggests the need for bringing finer analytical tools to account for Americans' missionary work abroad, at least those missionary efforts outside the continental United States in contexts of settler colonialism, and in these later moments of the 20th century. Further, David's book makes a good case for more attention to, as he puts it, the morally developmental question of what conditions have promoted and enabled the diminution of racism, sexism, imperialism, xenophobia, and not just their formation and proliferation. Work, for example, to continue filling out histories of Pan-Africanism, African-American anti-imperialism, tricontinentalism, and also the history of critiques of imperialism from elite political actors. Protestants Abroad clearly covers much ground, and through it, David makes observations in the text and in the footnotes that will no doubt inspire a great many future projects. For instance, I've wondered about the significance of the class position of David's subjects, something he points out in several instances. Roger Sherman Green, who had directed the Chinese Medical Board, comes to mind as the most obvious example here. Men like him, we hear repeatedly, came from privilege and were educated at places like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And so I wonder, how did class, privilege, and habitus intersect with religious ideology in shaping the sensibilities and politics of these white Anglo-Saxon Protestant subjects? How might it have allowed for or educated them in a certain sense of a horizon of possibility and shaped their liberal internationalism, or perhaps limited it? Is there more to say here? And I ask this having in the recesses of my mind the now decades-old work of Thomas Haskell on the origins of the humanitarian sensibility, a work that also takes up a morally developmental question. And Haskell pins the origins of humanitarian sensitivity on the altered perceptions and cognitive styles generated by and in capitalist market participation. Other work inspired by Protestants Abroad might expand the contexts in which David's subjects develop their worldviews and politics. And in that way, this work, this future work may modify or layer onto the causal argument of the book, which I see being laid out particularly in chapters 3 and 4. As a cultural historian, I thought in reading David's book of Michael Denning's work on the construction of the American cultural front of the 1930s to fight fascism abroad and racism at home. And if there's more to say here on how the fight against fascism shaped these missionaries' developing worldviews. I thought, too, of Christina Klein's Cold War Orientalism, Asia in the Middlebrow Imagination, 1945 to 1961. Klein examines some of the same literature and subjects as David, the Landons, Henry Luce, Pearl Buck, for examples, and I think her account makes for rather rich pairing with Protestants Abroad. While for David, the Cold War seems to serve largely as the context that allowed his subjects already fashioned into missionary cosmopolitans to take up positions of significant influence and exercise anti-imperialist and or anti-racist dispositions, for Klein, the early Cold War and decolonization figure as ideological challenges that provoked the work of culture makers. And that challenge was, how was the United States, then exerting influence in Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and so on through this period, to understand and represent itself? As she poses the problem, how can we define our nation as a non-imperial world power in the age of decolonization? Much like David, Klein reads an anti-imperialism in the cultural production of her middlebrow intellectuals. Yet even while she allows for ambiguities in their work, and even a genuine utopian impulse in some, Klein also emphasizes how they served as legitimating discourses, as expressions that legitimated US expansion while denying its coercive or imperial nature. So what of that Cold War and decolonization context and their exigencies, a context that some scholars have also emphasized as significant to modern civil rights history? Where do these stand in relation to the explanatory forces of Protestant theology and the experience of missionary contact that David emphasizes in the development of an anti-racist and anti-imperialist and multicultural politics? Emphasizing the Cold War and decolonization context would seem to foreground the reach and also the limitations of missionary cosmopolitans' politics for achieving more egalitarian social relations, and underscore the fact that the rise of a missionary cosmopolitanism, a check on Christian nationalism, did not mean the diminishment of US power and influence in the world or exercises of it, but like in the case of development, it altered its presence or tenor. Indeed, one way of imagining reading Protestants Abroad is as a chapter in the history of the passage from British global hegemony to US. I suspect Protestants abroad may also invite efforts to bring forward other historical actors who contributed to the making of a multicultural politics. Hollinger notes at the outset of his story that the Protestants he studies in these pages were one of several groups issuing what he calls comparable challenges to imperialist US foreign policy and racist domestic politics. So what of actors with different theologies or different social locations? In terms of the latter, I imagine some will continue to develop histories of missionary women. David asks in his conclusion why missionary cosmopolitanism had so little to say about women, a valuable question. So too may be continued work on what women missionary cosmopolitans like Margaret Landon or even Jenny Carell had to say about the world and Americans' place in it. I imagine some here may inquire about Catholics. I, for one, thought of Thomas Dooley and the work of Jim Fisher on radical Catholics. Others may press on David's characterization of evangelicals and their political commitments. Admittedly, these groups had a different endowment of social and political capital than David's protagonists. But recent work, like Heather Curtis's Holy Humanitarians, does give us some reason to consider how we might account for and reckon with the role of evangelicals and, more generally, non-elites, even the people in the pews. And I'll leave the further development of this matter to the specialists in the room. Finally, Protestants abroad may also inspire US-based scholars to produce new histories of these missionaries and missionary encounters and their significance that mirror the cosmopolitanism of their subjects. That is, histories that include and even center the perspectives and experiences of those indigenous peoples and converts, the non-white voices that David credits the missionaries and missionary-affiliated for bringing forward, figures like James Yen or Toyohiko Kagawa. New research might also consider the Japanese, South Asian, or Chinese historiographies of these encounters and their ramifications, and in that regard make moves away from what some US in the world scholars criticize, fairly or not, as methodological nationalism. Needless to say, these are but a handful of the lines of inquiry provoked by Protestants abroad as I read the book. These are ones, again, that occurred to me in reading a work of history that has been especially welcome to dwell on at a time when semblances of human solidarity can seem all too weak here at home. Thank you.
I want to echo the thanks to all of you, to Kathy for inviting me here. I've had a lovely visit all 3 days of doing different types of things. And also just a word to say that thank you to the Cushwa Center. And I know Mr. Cushwa, I see you back there, and just want to say this organization, this center, has been formative for me since the Engendering American Catholicism session that took place right as I was finishing graduate school in 1995. Is that what you said? And has been important for me from a distance as well as here in the room for many, many years. So I'm grateful to be back. The first time that I heard that David Hollinger was writing this book was, I think, also the first time I met him, which was in the spring of 1999 over lunch at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And I only want to mention this because the occasion for this, and I was as intimidated as Kathy suggests she was, I was a young nobody, and David was spending time, he was spending a semester, I guess, at the Institute for Advanced Study, and reached out to my husband, Lee Schmidt, and me, and invited us to lunch to talk about missionaries and missionary children and American religion. And I just remember being amazed that he was interested in my views and any knowledge that I had, and made me feel so comfortable. And that says so much to me about who David is as a mentor, not only to his own students, who I know could say a great deal more about that, but to so many other people in the field. And I know others of you have had that experience too. So I just want to say a public thank you for that kind of generosity and the role model you've been for so many of us. Protestants Abroad is an absolutely stunning book, full stop. And I mean this in two distinct, although related ways. First, it is stunning in that it is truly magnificent in its scope, and both its depth and its reach, in its narrative drama, which I was not expecting, its unique and luminous insights, and more. It's just a splendid, artful work of scholarly analysis. And I know from having other conversations with other people just this weekend that many others agree. Secondly, it is stunning in the sense of astonishing the reader with the story it tells, very persuasively, of the American leader after leader after leader after countless more leaders across numerous fields relating to politics, government, foreign relations, literature, art, publishing, academia, civil rights activism, and more, who were children of missionaries or otherwise connected to the missionary enterprise, but mostly children, and who made extraordinarily important contributions to a widening awareness in this country of the humanity, integrity, and complexity of peoples and cultures across the globe. In so many ways, the book revises what we thought we knew about missionaries. Now, as I say, I've long known that David was writing this book, and he has shared a few examples with me over the years, as I'm sure he has with many of you. But I had no idea how many figures, men and women, you would find and document David as part of this riveting story. How many distinct areas of influence you would trace, which truly boggled my mind. And again, from my recent conversations with others who have read it, there's widespread bogglement in your audience. So fair warning to anyone who has not yet read it, this is not a book you can or want to skim. It is a book to read slowly and carefully and to savor all the way to the powerful conclusion, about which more in a moment. John Hersey, Henry Luce, Pearl Buck, I had no idea how fascinating she was. Edmund Soper, Kenneth and Margaret Landon, dear God, Ruth Harris, Rosamond Frame, Sherwood Moran, Molly Yard, the president of the National Organization for Women, was an MK. It was just a wonderful, astonishing story. Among other things, I was delighted and more than a little surprised to see so many women here, significant characters in their own right, woven into this larger story, just as women's historians have called for so long. Now, of course, it's hard not to read the book without thinking of still more examples. And I just want to call out two that are especially salient for historians of religion and for other scholars of religion, for that matter. The late Bill Hutchison, as Rebecca mentioned a moment ago, gets a citation in the book for his scholarly work on the history of American foreign missions. But Hollinger skips over the fact, which I know he knows, that Bill himself was the son of Presbyterian missionaries who served in Iran, and Bill's wife, Jenny, was the daughter of missionaries who served in Egypt. And in their own educational and professional journeys, Bill and Jenny both beautifully illustrate the pattern of cosmopolitan engagement with the world that David has called to our attention. And through Bill's long scholarly and pedagogical labors on the history of Protestant liberalism, he bequeathed countless gifts from that legacy to generations of students. And I gratefully count myself among them, and others here, Tom Tweed, Heather Curtis, others who also benefited from his mentorship over the years. And I just want to say that Bill would have loved this book. The other example may be less well known to this crowd and does not hold the same scholarly stature among historians that Hutchison does. I'm thinking of Houston Smith, the late philosopher, he just died in 2016, who became a powerful and influential translator of the so-called world religions to PBS and CNN type audiences through years of hosting television programs. And by the way, these started in the 1950s in St. Louis while he was a faculty member at Washington University from 1947 to 1958. And then, of course, Houston Smith guested frequently on shows hosted by Bill Moyers and many others like him. There were whole video series devoted to his discussions of religions across the globe. And not to mention the influence Smith gained through his best-selling book, World Religions, first published in 1958, which has sold millions of copies, and he authored many other books as well. Well, Smith spent the first 17 years of his life in China as the son of Methodist missionaries there. And again, his impact on ordinary students and viewers seems really incalculable. I know a number of elderly folks in St. Louis who were his students way back when, and have really some incredible stories to tell about how he changed their lives. And just about a 20-second walk from my office around Graham Chapel, there is a Houston Smith garden in his memory. And again, he left WashU in 1958, so the impact there, and then later he taught at MIT, Syracuse, and ended his career at Berkeley. Of course, this has been really incalculable. Now, these two examples are somewhat younger than the majority of David's protagonists, but I think they add to his story in important ways relating directly to religion and the ways some missionary kids shed their Christian provincialism for a deeply respectful outlook toward other traditions and the echoes and reverberations that they made in that journey. I also want to acknowledge the appearance in the book of Roger Hackett, a historian of Japan at the University of Michigan, who was the son of Congregational missionaries raised in Kobe, Japan. Some of you may have caught on to the fact that this is the father of David Hackett, a historian of American religion at the University of Florida. He's a close friend to my husband Lee and me, and when we wrote him about seeing his dad in David's book, he wrote back this email. I'm excerpting it here. He said, "Yes, my father, a historian of Japan, was very much a part of this story. When I was a junior in high school, my father had a sabbatical. We lived in Kobe, and I attended the same Canadian academy he had. The school was created by the American Board, and most of his classmates were missionary kids. When I attended, those with missionary backgrounds were still about half the class. Just before I came to visit you this last summer," David wrote, "I attended a 50th year reunion of that class in Connecticut. Most were missionary kids, and quite a few had read the Hollinger book. Though not quite their story, we had quite a few conversations reflecting on its resonance with what we knew of the earlier generations." He continues, "I've always understood my father and his sibs to have been launched from liberal Protestantism into American culture. They all shed the religious language and ritual, but what continued was a strong moral integrity and serious engagement with ideas. This book suggests the larger context, boomerang, in which this took place. It is so fulfilling to see what was once family history become connected with a larger American and global history." End. And David, I imagine a lot of other people can say the same thing. And again, I think of the way David Hackett himself, as a scholar and a teacher, lo these many decades, has carried through this legacy. And he himself, by the way, became a devout Catholic with a deep interest and practice in Zen Buddhism. And part of the reason we see him every summer in Maine is because he goes on a silent retreat for some weeks in the Northeast. So the American religious historians among us share in this story in a very powerful way. Now let me shift a bit towards some more critical comments. Rebecca, you'll hear some resonance, I think, with some of Rebecca's. But since we are here at Cushwa, the question must be asked, yes, what about Catholics? Where do Catholic missionaries and Catholic children fit into this story? And how would the story change, or not, if their contributions were included? I know there are people who have already been thinking about this question, and I really look forward to that conversation to include Catholics and think about them in this whole account. Another weighty question that has already been raised about this book in print, and one whose hunch I share, relates to the book's claim that evangelical missionaries and missionary children did not typically develop the same kind of cosmopolitanism that the ecumenicals did. Some may fault Hollinger for not granting evangelicals the same complexity he so readily attributes to liberals, as Ryan Hoselton put it in his very thoughtful and overwhelmingly favorable review of the book for the Gospel Coalition. Hoselton put it like this. He wrote, "Maybe history really does lack examples of cosmopolitan evangelical missionaries, but I doubt it. Maybe they didn't write groundbreaking reports and novels on why the mission should adapt to new times. But many of these nameless men and women ended their years on the field with the foreign peoples they so deeply loved and valued, singing, 'Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing,' not 'God bless America,'" end quote. Now, having grown up in a religious world saturated with mission accounts from the Southern Baptist Convention's Women's Missionary Union, the WMU, accounts that overwhelmingly centered on bettering the conditions and working to heal the sufferings of diverse peoples across the globe, and even hints of justice and revolutionary movements, and not their evangelization, I feel somewhat akin to Hoselton in his point. And I think this is why I, like Nadine Gordimer, and I'm guessing David too, absolutely hated Barbara Kingsolver's novel, The Poisonwood Bible, with all of its caricatures about horrible missionaries. I remember just my feeling of disgust at that book, but I digress. I'm sorry. But I was glad you mentioned it. I was glad you mentioned it in there, David. Betsy Flowers, in her wonderful book, Into the Pulpit, about the WMU and its impact on Southern Baptist girls and women more broadly, has some very significant things to say about this organization and the importance of women's mission organizations more generally in conservative Protestant circles. David mentions the women's boards in the ecumenical denominations, pointing out, rightly, that they lost power as they were folded into unified missionary boards, reducing the women to a subdivision, as he puts it. But the same was not true for Southern Baptists. Looking a bit more closely, both at evangelical groups and at the women's missionary organizations that survived, and maybe I'm just really talking here about Southern Baptists who have something of a unique story in this regard, I realize, but this may shed some nuanced light on the possibilities for cosmopolitanism that indeed could be found there. Southern Baptist culture, after all, could produce a figure like Jimmy Carter, as cosmopolitan and anti-imperialist a U.S. leader as maybe we've seen in some time. In any case, somehow those women do mostly remain nameless in the archives, which also suggests why those folks didn't make it into Hollinger's sources, I realize. So Rebecca talked about class, which I think is a really important question here. There is an intellectual, professional emphasis, necessarily, I suppose, but in Protestants abroad, to be acknowledged in any nuanced contrast between the ecumenicals and the evangelicals. It's a realistic distinction, as I say, when it comes to influence, but it's also an uncomfortable gap. And I'd love to hear David say a few more words about that here. Yet another critical question to be raised, again in an atmosphere of near universal admiration for this book, is whether Hollinger overestimates the impact these ecumenical missionary children really had as individuals on American foreign policy, academia, and cultural attitudes more broadly. To what extent were they participating in changes that had many root causes and trajectories, rather than being generators of change themselves? A slightly different angle into this question of impact, more crudely put, and David hints at this, is this question. It would be to ask this: were they really liberal enough in the ways that many contemporary readers will think they ought to have been? I mean, I can imagine a lot of impatience coming out of the left toward Hollinger's analysis as being overly sunny in its rendering, something I'm not sure David has ever been accused of before, incidentally. But to this critique, I will say he has already made an exquisite response in his conclusion, and Rebecca cited part of this too, but here's the longer passage. He writes, "One benefit of looking at American history through the lens of contact theory is that it can help transfer the focus of analytic attention from A, the morally structural question of just how racist, sexist, imperialist, xenophobic, or otherwise deficient a given cohort was, to B, the morally developmental question of just what conditions have promoted and enabled the diminution of those evils. Too often, our preoccupation with the first, rather easily answered question gets in the way of our pursuit of the second, more challenging one," end quote. I deeply agree here with David's important corrective to the very common tendency to chastise the ancestors for their blind spots, which has been a much indulged pastime, especially since the study of liberalism became somewhat unfashionable in, I think, early 1990s or so. And indeed, contact theory is widely agreed to be a crucial factor in the rapidity of, for instance, changing attitudes toward LGBTQ people in the past couple of decades. And the lessons from that experience certainly merit wide application. But the risk here, as David well knows, as Bill Hutchison always articulated at copious length, as all of us know too, is that it lets not only them, the ancestors, but us too off the hook for profound moral failings. I was thinking here, those of you who know Bill will remember he could never utter a declarative sentence without endless qualifications following upon it. That kind of, painful almost sort of moral qualifying of his own failings and attempt at nuance. I don't see how we can read this book without the noisiness of our own Trump era in the background. The failures of cosmopolitanism to achieve real and lasting gains across the population, is that part of what's visible in our lasting incapacity to address immigration and other issues of contact within our own borders and across them? So I want to focus on the morally developmental question too, the how do we do this better questions, especially when it comes to overcoming American provincialism, the narcissism that comforts us with the sense of always being right and superior to others. Maybe the question is, how can the impact of that be more lasting? David did not, of course, begin writing this book in the Trump era, but he completed the book in that period. And it did not apparently temper what I take to be an optimistic attitude toward this story, refreshingly optimistic, in fact. So I want to ask him to reflect on if and how the times we now live in have affected his views of the people who came before and their long-term impact. It is a stunning book, and I'm deeply grateful to you, David, for writing it. It will be generating contemplation and conversation for years to come. Thank you.
David Hackett I met when I got to Ann Arbor, and I was introduced to him by Roger, and I now realize that one reason it never occurred to me that the David Hackett, who's the historian, is the same Hackett family, is Roger introduced David to me as he was leaving to become a Trappist monk. And my understanding is that he would never speak a word again. And so I had no idea that, that the engagements that he had religiously at that time were then integrated with a scholarly career. So I'm delighted to hear that. It's a complete new thing. I knew about David Hackett as a historian, but never made the connection, which obviously I should have. The references to Bill Hutchison are also telling, and I realize now that I had learned so much from Bill and talked with him quite a lot before he died when I was getting started on this, that I had, in some kind of cognitive failure, classified him as amongst the scholars rather than as the subjects of the book. But of course, he is very much a subject of what I'm talking about, and I now regret that I didn't invoke him more in that context. But as a general matter, the thing that's very exciting about these comments, and this applies to a number of the other forums that I've been to in the last few months, is that I get the impression that that I got enough things right. In other words, that there are a number of claims and points that I make that are convincing and that can be part of our understanding of the United States and of religion and Protestantism and so forth. And on the other hand, there are all sorts of openings for new things. Now that's very important to me, because as I was doing this book, it was very clear to me that I wasn't going to get it all together and that there were all sorts of loose ends and things that I could just touch on. Now, I was completing it at the same time that my colleague Tom LeCoeur was writing a 1,000-page book on death, and that my colleague Yuri Slezkin was writing a 1,000-page book on the Bolsheviks. And I had to decide, am I going to do a 1,000-page book on the missionaries? And I decided not to, partly for a strategic reason, that I wanted to get out there what I had to say and wanted people to be able to read it all the way through. But a very important thing for me was discovering and touching upon things that I fully anticipated that other people would pick up and do stuff with that I didn't. And both Rebecca and Marie have listed a number of those things, and I want to talk a little bit about some of them, and others can come up here in our discussion, I'm sure. This is a book that many editors think of as a book for people that are interested in missionaries, when actually it's a book for people who are not interested in missionaries but should be. And so it's the idea of getting that across, that there's such a vast panorama of interesting aspects to modern American history that are accessible if we look at the missionary project and its various dimensions that are not out there now. And that's a subset, but a very particular one, of the matter of where American religious history stands in relation to the history of the United States in general. When I was president of the OAH in 2011, my presidential address was the first in the 104-year history of that organization to have anything to do with religion at all. So now there were a few articles in the flagship journals on American religion, but mostly not. So the last few years, there are more people that are involved in this, and I'm glad to be part of a kind of mini movement in the historical profession to pay more attention and to get it integrated with the rest of American history. I remember after that speech in Houston, several people came up to me and said that they'd never heard of any of this before, and they were sort of resistant to it. And one very eminent historian, I won't embarrass her by naming her, said, well, now, David, really, these differences between the different kinds of Protestants, ultimately, they don't matter that much. Aren't they really all the same? I mean, what's the difference between these people? And so I deadpanned, well, it's sort of like the difference between a Shackmanite and a Canaanite Trotskyist. oh, I had no idea it was such a big deal. And a couple of them, so they needed a little bit of instruction on this. So I did find the lack of religious literacy, to say nothing of scriptural literacy, on the behalf on the part of my colleagues, really quite amazing. Let me take up a couple of the things that were mentioned by Rebecca and Marie. This matter of the dialectical and interactive character of foreign experience and domestic experience is indeed something I've been preoccupied with a long time. And my student, Nils Gilman, the leading student of modernization theory, was a dissertation that I encouraged for this. Another student of mine, Daniel Immerwahr, who has a terrific book about to come out called How to Hide an Empire, which is also consistent with this. So I've been involved with this as a graduate teacher as well as a scholar for a very long time. And that also speaks to the insularity of the study of religion. Very little of the study of religion has gotten out there in the main agenda of the profession when it comes to that dialectic. I mean, I didn't go back and look at the Pease book. I don't think that had any reference at all to anything religious, but yet the themes are very much there. I'm thrilled that both of them quote my favorite paragraph in the book, this thing at the end where, and this is a result of a career. I've been, I published my first article in 1968, so I've been in this business a long time. And I've just long since lost patience with this practice of, pointing the finger, oh, you're an Orientalist, you're a racist, you're a sexist, and so forth, even though it's often true, because it doesn't carry us very far. It's the easy question. So the harder question, it seems to me, is to try and explain what are the sustaining conditions of this or that moral ethos. And that means what causes the stuff we don't like, as well as in this book, some of the circumstances that diminish the things that most of us who bring to this would be worried about. So the morally developmental and the morally structural seems to me a very important thing to work on. I like the Christina Klein book quite a lot. I was frustrated a little bit. I think there is an ideological blinder there. Her major case for images of Asia in the Reader's Digest is actually Jimmy Yin, and she doesn't mention Jimmy Yin at all. So there are really huge missionary-connected things, and I think that Christina Klein, although she has a lot of good ideas there, it's an example of just being blind to many aspects of the missionary-connected experience. I like the Heather Curtis book, too, for what it says about before 1920. I hope those of you that have read that book would agree that she has a very weak understanding of evangelicalism and ecumenicalism in the post-1920 period. But the book is mostly about the period before 1920, and I think it's very good in what it has to say about that. The references to Houston Smith also attracted my attention, and I think that's somebody that I should have done a lot more with. I hope other people will do a lot more with him. It's an example of a whole panorama of interesting people that are out there that deserve much more extensive accounts. On the matter of women in general and what happens to ecumenical women, including missionary-connected ecumenical women, I'm very interested in seeing how further scholarship proceeds on that. When I was writing those sections of the book, I did correspond at some length with Dana Robert, Peggy Bendroth, and others that know about that. And they were very interested in the question, and I think I've helped persuade Peggy now to do a book on the topic, so she'll work on it a little bit more, but I was unable to extract from them very many cases of where ecumenical women were prominent in a national forum, in a national frame of reference for feminist activities, for women's rights. And that's why I say in the book pretty much that second-wave feminism was a Jewish conspiracy. And I think demographically you can find a lot of evidence for that. So the ecumenical women, the evidence for their political activism still seems to me, and I'm glad to be persuaded otherwise, and perhaps people here will be able to persuade me otherwise, still seems to me to be overwhelmingly within ecclesiastical institutions and within organizations that are church-centered. So if you can look in almost all the denominations, including the Southern Baptists and the Northern Presbyterians and so forth, and you find women that are involved in these institutional activities, but you do not find, with the exception of Pearl Buck and Molly Yard, both of whom were long since out of the church before they surfaced as feminists, you do not find women active in public women's rights activities on remotely the scale that you might predict on the basis of the experience that they've had in the mission field and the ideology, Galatians 3:28 and all that. So I'd like to hear more about that, but I remain unpersuaded. So I'd like to be informed, like to have my mind changed. The same applies to some extent, although I'm less confident about this, about the character, the depth, the ferocity, and indeed the fierceness of the ecumenical evangelical divide. Now, when I began this research on missionaries, I was aware of this classic conflict between what Martin Marty calls the two families of American Protestants, and I pick that up and try to develop it. But I had the hunch when I started this that a value of this research would be that I would find much more continuity between the evangelical party and the ecumenical party. I began this research with the assumption that I would find many more cases than I did of evangelical missionary types making a progression toward greater cosmopolitanism. Now, there are some examples of that. I did find some. Maria's right to raise that as a matter for ongoing research, and I'd like to see more done on that. But what I found was that when you go through the public statements of the missionary theorists and the missionary boards and the main missionary conventions, like the Wheaton Conference of 1966, Lausanne in 1974, when you read the books and articles written by evangelicals, the attack on the World Council of Churches and on the ecumenicals and on their theories of mission is overwhelming. I corresponded with a number of evangelical scholars while I was writing those sections of the book. I asked, tell me where the Hocking report is refuted. Tell me where it's discussed. Again and again, I get these letters back. David, they don't talk about the Hocking report. There's no engagement with it. So what I found is a dynamic, and I'd be glad to have confirmations of this, corrections of it, clear clarifications. I found a dynamic whereby many of the evangelicals accept more and more of the liberal outlook but deny it, systematically deny it. So there is the same movement gradually, but the fear of becoming like these liberals seems to me overwhelming, at least in the literature that I read. Now, on the ground, it's different. If I were writing a book about how missions actually operate in India or Japan or Angola or wherever, the cooperation between the ecumenicals and the evangelicals is much greater. Although even there, if you read the wonderful new book by Melanie McAllister, Kingdom of God Has No Borders, a very detailed account of what's going on in Uganda and Nigeria, other places, there you find again a narrative that's distinctive to evangelicals, with the tendency to enchant the primitive world, okay, re-enchantment of it, and also a tendency to conflate the victimization of Christians abroad with the victimizations of Christians in the United States, which brings me back to the age of Trump, because indeed we are in a time when the government of the United States is being urged to prioritize the protection of Christians abroad, and in an age of Islamophobia, that seems to me to be a problem. I think that the cosmopolitan tradition that I'm talking about in this book is very much under pressure right now, and the main thing seems to me to be education. It's my sense that the intelligentsia and the Democratic Party allies of it have generally been inattentive to vast sections of the American population, written off as flyover country, that sort of thing. I'm sensitive to that as a son of Idaho. And it just seems to me that there's a failure to promote policies and educational programs that would speak to a larger segment of the public. So now you have a situation where one political party and a president is basing their politics and their future on the most ignorant and least educated segments of the electorate. The liberals seem to me to be not very good at responding to that. This seems to me to be a very serious problem for the next few years, because once the Democrats get in power, which I think they will, there remains a vast wad of Americans who are mobilized now as a result of the Trumpian anti-cosmopolitanism, and it'll be a great struggle to bring them back in. So I note a huge debate among liberals today as to whether to just outvote those people or to incorporate them. And those of you that have followed any of my writings about the circle of the we, you know, I think they ought to be incorporated. So I'm in favor of engagement. And I'll conclude my remarks with one anecdote about that, which is also relevant to something analogous to the Catholic question. It'll be interesting to what some of you have to say about that. I didn't talk much about the Catholics because I didn't see very many signs of missionary-related Catholics being prominent in public life, okay, the institutions that I talk about. Something else if you're talking about what happens in a religious order. But the Catholic question I'm eager to hear discussed here. Many people here will know much more about that than I do. But the other thing is the Mormons. Okay, get this. I have this little footnote about how, well, the Mormons do all this missionary work, but there doesn't seem to be much attention to what the impact is of the missionary experience on the Mormons. So I look and look and look, and I write to Jan Ships and all the people who study Mormonism and say, what about this? And they all write back that there really isn't anything. So I have this sort of grouchy footnote in there about how the Mormons don't study this. Well, 2 weeks ago, I get an invitation from the top brass of the Mormon church and a group of people at Brigham Young, and they say, well, Hollinger, we guess you're right about this. We don't do much on this, but we're going to fix it. So we, the big-time Mormons, are going to convene a conference a year from now in Salt Lake, and you can join us amid the ghosts of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. They didn't quite put it that way, but that was my understanding of it. I would come and I would keynote a conference discussing just this question. And they're going to commission a series of research papers on the Mormon Missionary Project, and I'll have a chance then to talk with them about that. So I offer that as an anecdote. If it's not optimism, at least it's a refusal to give up. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Rebecca and Marie for your provocative comments on what was already a provocative book to get us thinking about some questions. And David, too, thank you for your response. And I think the Mormon Church does a better job of wording invitations than the Cushwa Center does if they did truly invite you that way. We're going to take about a 10-minute break to refresh coffee.